So this is the last lecture in chapter 26, the reproductive systems. And we started with meiosis and then moved on to the male reproductive system. And then today we'll be covering the female reproductive system. We'll start by talking about the anatomy, and then we will move on to the physiology, which is fairly complex. But there is a really good graphic at the very end of the chapter that kind of puts it all together. So we'll start off by talking about the anatomy. The ovaries are the primary organ of the female reproductive system. The ovaries will produce gametes, and the ovaries will also secrete the hormones estrogen and progesterone. And we just use estrogen as a common term for a family of steroid proteins in this class. The primary one is actually going to be estradiol, and then there are two other forms, estrone and estriol, but we just lump them together and we call them estrogen. We'll talk about the internal genitalia, the external genitalia, and then just like the male system had a duct system, the female system has a duct system as well. So we'll start off by talking about the ovaries, the uterine tubes, which are also known as the fallopian tubes, which are going to then connect down to the uterus. We'll talk about the cervix, the vagina, and then the external genitalia. The ovaries are paired structures that flank the uterus. They're about twice as large as an almond, so not terribly large, but very productive. Each is held in place by several ligaments. So if you go back to this one, there is the suspensory ligament that kind of is on the top section. We also looked at the round ligament, which is over here in lab. So those are two of the major ligaments, the round ligament, the suspensory ligament, and then there's going to be something called the broad ligament, which I guess is not on this diagram. It's on a later diagram that is going to have the round ligament as part of that, but it's a system of mesentery, and it will form support structures for the uterus and then the ovary. So that mesovarium is part of that broad ligament, as well as the suspensory ligament, not the round ligament. I'm sorry about that. The take-home message is that the ovary is going to be held in place by several ligaments. And the main ligament that is going to support the female reproductive system is called the broad ligament, because it will support multiple structures. So we get to it more when we get to there's another diagram of the uterus, and it will show the broad ligament. But each ovary is held in place by several ligaments. The main ligament of the female reproductive system is going to be that broad ligament. For the ovaries, are there are two layers. There is a outer cortex and then an inner medulla, and that's going to be surrounded by a fibrous capsule that is histologically, developmentally similar to the capsule that surrounds the testes in males. The female system and the male system have many homologous structures, meaning they came from similar tissues and either developed into the male reproductive structure or the female reproductive structure. While interesting, you're not going to need to know what the coordinating structures is, like what it would be in the male and what it would be in the female. It's a lot of memorization, but just know that a lot of the structures do have counterparts in both the male and the female system. Okay, so there is this fibrous capsule, And then in the cortex is going to be where gametes form. So the cortex is going to contain the follicles. The medulla is going to contain blood vessels and nerves. So the follicles develop in the outer cortex, and this makes sense because they're going to have to be released from the outer surface during ovulation. Okay, so this wall will weaken and the mature follicle will rupture, releasing, the oocyte. Okay, so cortex contains follicles, produces gametes. The medulla is where you'll find blood vessels and nerves. The female duct system is different from the male duct system in that the male duct system is a continuous structure. So we have the seminiferous tubules, they have coiled ducts leading to straight ducts, leading to the rete testes, leading to the epididymis, out the vas deferens. It's a complete system. The female system is more complicated in that the uterine tube system has no direct contact with the ovaries. So when an oocyte is ovulated and released, it's actually released into the peritoneal cavity. It is up to the fimbriae of these uterine tubes to create a current and collect it. But we do, so females will lose oocytes into the pelvic cavity. Okay, so your body, the female body is hoping not to lose very many, and there are chemical attractants and there are cilia that create currents. And then these fimbriae are kind of like a catcher's mitt, but there is no direct connection. And this actually, at the last lecture, we talked about STIs. This is why STIs can become much more of a problem in females than in males. In males, because that duct system is closed, the infection will stay relatively contained. In females, especially with things like gonorrhea, chlamydia, that infection can work its way up. Bacteria move pretty rapidly, and they can move up through the uterine tubes and then into the pelvic cavity, which is causes pelvic inflammatory disease. So STIs are much more serious in females. Not that they're not serious in males, but it can cause infertility and more of a widespread infection. Okay, back to anatomy, right? Okay, so we have the ovaries here with the outer cortex with its follicles, the inner medulla with its blood supply. Then connecting to that are going to be the uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes. And these sections here are finger-like, and they are called fimbriae. They act as a catcher's mitt to catch the ovulated oocyte. As I mentioned, they'll like surround the ovary, and then they've got ciliated cells that will sweep and create a current of fluid flow to move the oocyte along. Then the uterine tubes connect to the uterus. The uterus has a lower section called the cervix. So this lower section is the cervix. This is the cervical canal. There is an inner orifice and an outer orifice to the cervix. And this becomes somewhat important because there will be mucus plugs at these locations. All right. And then the vagina is going to be the canal leading from the cervix down to the external environment. So we're going to go back over these structures again. The uterine tubes are also called the fallopian tubes. They are going to receive the ovulated oocyte and are the usual site of fertilization. So fertilization, usually, especially for a successful pregnancy, will occur in the uterine or the fallopian tubes. If fertilization actually occurs in the uterus, it's unlikely that that zygote will implant. It will probably be flushed through. So it needs a few days of development as it's traveling along those fallopian tubes. Occasionally, that's where you get an ectopic pregnancy, is it will try and implant in the fallopian tube, and there's just not enough support there for it to survive. But the fallopian tubes are the usual site of fertilization for a successful pregnancy. Covered by the peritoneum, we'll show you that broad ligament, and then supported by a short mesentery. There are three regions of the uterine tube. The infundibulum, which is associated with those fimbriae. The fimbriae are the finger-like projections that act like a catcher's mitt to catch that oocyte. The ampulla is kind of the middle part, and this is where fertilization usually occurs. And then the isthmus is the narrow connection that empties into the uterus. During ovulation, uterine tubes capture the oocyte as the fimbriae stiffen and sweep, creating a current. And then it is carried along by the tubes, just like the ductus deferens, the vas deferens, are like those thick tubes of smooth muscle. The uterine tubes also have a thick layer of smooth muscle, which will have peristaltic contractions to move the egg along to the uterus, as well as ciliated cells. So there's smooth muscle. There's actually non-ciliated cells and ciliated cells, and the ciliated cells will help move that oocyte along. Okay, we've gone from the fimbriae to the ampulla to the isthmus, and then now we're going to the uterus. So the uterus is a hollow, thick-walled muscular organ. It is going to receive, retain, and nourish the fertilized ovum. It has, kind of like the stomach, it has a fundus, it has a body, and then it ends in the cervix, which the cervix is the region, the cervical canal is the lumen part. Cervical glands secrete a thick mucus plug that blocks sperm entry except during mid-cycle. So it wants to prevent bacteria and pathogens, but it also only wants to allow sperm access to the oocyte at the proper time for fertilization. Supports of the uterus, it also has lots of ligaments, including this broad ligament, and then it has these pouches, which are folds of the peritoneum to also help in its support. There are three layers of the uterus. There is the perimetrium, which we don't hear about very much. It is the outermost serous layer. It is also continuous with the visceral peritoneum. So it is the visceral peritoneum. So an outer layer, you remember kind of like with muscle, we have like the perimysium and the epimysium and the endomysium. So peri is on the outside. And then we have, for the uterus, there's this thick myometrium. It is a very thick layer of smooth muscle. And then the endometrium, the mucosal lining. So three layers of the uterine wall: the perimetrium, which is the outermost serous layer, the myo meaning muscle, metrium, thick middle layer of smooth muscle, and then the endometrium, which is the mucosal lining. So you should know these 3 layers of uterine wall and where you would find them. For the endometrium, it has 2 layers. It has a functional layer called stratum functionalis, and then the basal layer, stratum basalis. So if you're drawing your uterus, you have the perimetrium. Actually, we'll make this one the myometrium because it's red. And then there is the perimetrium just right on the outside. And then next to the myometrium, this is going to be the basal layer. Okay. So the basal layer is unresponsive to ovarian hormones. It is the layer that is not shed during the menstrual cycle. It's going to give rise to a new stratum functionalis. So you don't want to get rid of all of the endometrium, then you wouldn't have anything to build back. So that stratum basalis is always there. It's the underlying, kind of like the germinal layer that forms a new stratum functionalis. The stratum basalis also has what are called straight arteries. So this is something we'll get into way at the end, but it's the type of arteries that will determine whether or not that layer breaks off. So for now, just note that you do need to know these 3 layers of the uterus and the characteristics of the 2 layers of the endometrium. Okay, so that stratum basalis has straight arteries, is unresponsive to ovarian hormones, and is not shed during menstruation. The stratum functionalis is going to be the one that is closest to the lumen. It has spiral arteries, which we'll talk about in greater detail later, and it is responsive to changes in ovarian hormones. It is also the layer that is shed during the menstrual cycle. So you do need to know the characteristics of stratum functionalis, as well as the characteristics of stratum basalis. This is a diagram, and it does not show the perimetrium. It just shows the myometrium, because this is really fun looking at blood supply. We have, remember those gonadal arteries, and so that was an ovarian artery. Now we have a uterine artery. Off of the uterine artery is going to give rise to the arcuate artery. Remember, these names should be familiar. They're similar to what we saw in the kidney. But so the uterine artery is the primary artery, gives rise to the arcuate artery, which is going to be part of that myometrium. Then radial arteries are going to radiate out from that. And then depending on if it is feeding into the stratum functionalis, that stratum functionalis will have spiral arteries. Okay, so stratum functionalis has spiral arteries. The stratum basalis has straight arteries. So myometrium is here, stratum basalis here, and then stratum functionalis is up here. This is also a diagram that you might see again. So moving on, so we covered the ovaries, the uterine tubes with their fimbriae leading to the uterus. We kind of bypassed the cervix. We'll come back to that a little bit. And then leading to the vagina. So the vagina serves as the birth canal, passageway for menstrual flow, and is considered the organ of copulation. It lies between the bladder and the rectum. It has 3 layers, just like the uterus did. It has a fibroelastic adventitia, a smooth muscle muscularis, and then a mucosa. And in the vagina, the mucosa is stratified squamous. Vaginal secretions are acidic in adult females. This helps maintain antibacterial properties, but alkaline in adolescents, which actually makes adolescents a lot more susceptible to bacterial infections because they don't have that extra layer of protection with the acidity. For external genitalia, it's collectively also called the vulva. It is going to consist of the mons pubis, a fatty area overlying the pubic symphysis, labia majora, posterior fatty skin folds, labia minora, thin skin folds lying within the labia majora, the vestibule, which contains the openings to both the urethra and the vagina, the greater vestibular glands. These are going to release mucus into the vestibule. The clitoris, it's the counterpart of the glans penis in the male. It's erectile tissue. And then the bulbs of the vestibule, which these engorge with blood during sexual stimulation to close off the urethral orifice as part of its purpose. So most of these were covered in anatomy. So should be somewhat familiar with their location, the mons pubis, the labia majora, labia minora. This is the vestibule containing both the external urethral orifice as well as the opening to the vagina. And then there are bulbs and glands for mucus, the glands. Speaking of glands, okay, so most of the glands that we talk about with both the reproductive systems, many of them are mucus secreting. But if we talk about the mammary glands, the really interesting thing about the mammary glands is they are actually modified sweat glands. Okay, so these are a very different type of gland. They are present in both male and female, but they are functional only in females. The purpose is to produce milk. These glands are divided into lobes, which are then further divided into lobules. The lobes are distinct in that they're divided by a septa, and they are pretty well contained from each other, which this can play a role in keeping certain types of, like breast cancer, ductal cancer, confined to certain ducts. We won't really have time to go into breast cancer, but as I mentioned, you guys can talk about it in the discussion section. The lobules contain the glands that produce milk. They are suspensory ligaments. Breast size is actually due to the amount of overlying fat deposits. Okay, so you've got lobes that are contained with septa. Within these are glands that produce milk when you've got prolactin hormone present. So, and then overlying fat tissue. So now we're going to move on to the physiology. It begins in the fetus. So Production of primary, this is a really big thing. Production of primary oocytes occurs only in the fetus. So in the fetal period, stem cells called oogonia divide by mitosis to produce primary oocytes. In primary oocytes, meiosis is arrested in late prophase 1. This is before crossing over occurs, and they're arrested until puberty occurs. I've got some diagrams that are pictures that are better than words. LH is going to activate maturation of a single oocyte to finish meiosis 1, forming a secondary oocyte and a polar body. If a sperm penetrates the secondary oocyte, meiosis 2 occurs, producing an ovum and a second polar body. Let me get to the picture. Okay, I'll come back to this. So this is a lot more, I think, helpful. So before birth, primordial follicles are already present, and they are going to go through mitosis and create a primary oocyte. But it is going to arrest so it pauses in prophase 1. So we've had a mitotic division, it forms a primary oocyte, and at birth, there are going to be, I think, about 7 million. Do I have it written down? It's either 4 million or 7 million. I can't remember. But there is a finite number. Entering at puberty, it's down to about 400,000. I think I have these numbers somewhere else. Okay, so, but the big thing is that primary oocytes are created during the fetal period, and then they arrest, so they pause in prophase 1, and they don't continue. Unlike when sperm are produced, you get the initial division, this initial mitotic division, and then one daughter cell A stays back in the germ cell line, and then daughter cell B continues through meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, producing 4 equal spermatids. In the female reproductive system, the fetus is going to undergo mitosis, the fetal oogonium, that germ cell line, and then it will produce a primary oocyte and then a stem cell as well. Okay, but that primary oocyte is going to, there's no more production of those after birth. Okay, so this is the number, the starting maximum for the female reproductive, the life of that female reproductive system. So these are going to arrest until puberty, and then in puberty, because of hormonal changes, which we'll talk about, that primary oocyte will then, it will undergo meiosis 1, and it will form a secondary oocyte and a polar body. And this is only going to occur in something called the dominant follicle. So a subset of follicles are selected to start development each month. Only about 1 out of the 20 that are selected will become the dominant follicle. And that dominant follicle is the one that will undergo complete meiosis 1 and then form a secondary oocyte, but then it stops in metaphase 2. The other thing is, and then it will actually not complete meiosis until after fertilization, which I find very weird, but that's how the body works. So at this point here, there are 23 chromosomes, but with double the number of DNA. So they still need to, they've aligned, but they haven't been pulled apart. So then fertilization occurs and they rapidly pull apart, form two cells, but the cells are unequal in size. Every time in meiosis, when we get cell division, a polar body is produced and then a larger cell. And so this is going to suck all of the nutrients, all the cytoplasm, all the fructose, ATP, and mitochondria into one cell, so into that oocyte. Then if it gets fertilized and completes meiosis 2, a second polar body is produced. So in the female, we produce one ovum and then 3 polar bodies. Sometimes this polar body splits, sometimes this one just gets discarded. But in order to keep things kind of like a 4 and 4, where we get 4 spermatids from one germ cell mitosis division, then we get 3 unequal small cells, polar bodies, and 1 large ovum. And we're going to, we're going to go through this a lot, because there's 2 phases. There's the follicle development, and then there's the oocyte development, and then we add the uterine cycle on at the end. So let's go back. So we're going to take a look at this part, the follicle development. The ovarian follicle is the functional unit of the ovary. It's going to produce an oocyte. There are additional cell types. One of the important cell types are called granulosa cells. These are the cells that are going to surround the oocyte. So the oocyte is the part that has the genetic material. It's the actual going to become the actual egg. The granulosa cells are the cells that surround it. It's considered pregranulosa if there's only a single layer present, or granulosa if there's more than one layer present. And this is because they're not functional in secreting hormones until you get enough of them together. The fetus has primordial follicles, and these are going to then become secondary follicles. So we're born with primordial follicles. They are going to, as we go through puberty and onto menopause, these become secondary follicles and then antral follicles. So there's follicle development, which starts with primordial, then actually goes to primary, then secondary, then mature antral follicles, also called tertiary follicles or Graafian follicles. Okay. So for the follicle development, at the end of the fetal stage, will end with primordial follicles, and those will be continued on through pre-puberty. So from birth to puberty, the ovaries are going to contain primordial follicles. When puberty is occurring, and it takes about 3 years between the onset of menstruation to reliable ovulation. So this is a process. The primordial follicles will start developing, then some undergo what are called atresia. They don't make it. Eventually, ovulation becomes regular, and primordial follicles will get recruited in groups of about 20 due to follicle stimulating hormone. They'll become primary follicles. Then one will become dominant. That dominant one continues from secondary follicle onto a mature Graafian or antral follicle. Then ovulation occurs. This is about day 14 of the cycle, which we'll go into. The oocyte is ovulated, and the mature follicle develops into a corpus luteum. So this is the follicular cycle. We're born with primordial. This is where follicles stay pre-puberty. Then during puberty, we start recruiting them in about groups of 20 to become primary follicles, secondary follicles. A dominant follicle will emerge to become the mature Graafian follicle. Ovulation is stimulated, the oocyte is released, the follicular cells then develop into the corpus luteum. The two primary cell types are going to be the oocyte, which contains the genetic material, and then the granulosa cells, which are going to produce hormones. There are also cells called theca cells that we mentioned in your book that also produce hormones. What's going on in the oocyte? Okay, so just in the oocyte, not talking about the follicle in a whole, is that the first event occurs during fetal development, where there's mitosis. The stem cell has to regenerate a daughter cell to maintain the stem line, but then a primary oocyte is going to be produced as well. Meiosis begins, but arrests right away at prophase 1 before crossing over even occurs. Baby is born, pre-puberty, we still stay at this, the oocytes still stay at this primary arrested stage. We'll talk about how hormones come in just a few slides. With hormonal stimulation, the primary sites are then going to complete meiosis 1 and discard half of its genetic material as a polar body. And then the secondary oocyte, so this has the correct, this is one end, but it has double the amount of DNA. And then it will, if fertilized, it will continue meiosis 2, producing a second polar body as well as a haploid ovum. Oops, my connection is not stable. Okay. Ovulation occurs each month after puberty. A few primary oocytes are activated. This is caused by high hormonal levels, especially FSH. So FSH is going to recruit about 20 primary oocytes to mature, start maturation. The FSH level is going to then start to decline, because this is level declines. About 19 of them bow out, like they cannot survive this decline in follicle stimulating hormone. because oocytes are completely dependent on follicle stimulating hormone. Only the dominant follicle is going to survive this decline in FSH. The dominant follicle resumes meiosis 1, so it goes, because it was arrested in prophase 1, and so it's going to continue. After meiosis 1 is completed, 2 haploid cells with double DNA are going to be produced. A polar body that is really just genetic material, and then the secondary oocyte, which is a large cell with almost all of the mother cell cytoplasm and organelles. Mitochondrial DNA is contributed solely by the female ovum. A sperm is not large enough to also carry mitochondria with it. So mitochondrial DNA is maternally inherited. So during each monthly cycle, about 20 primary oocytes are recruited to start further maturation. This is due to leftover FSH from the preceding cycle. As that level starts to decline, most of them will self-implode. They'll atresia. It's called atresia, but it's apoptosis, where cell and programmed cell death. The dominant follicle will be able to still survive. It resumes meiosis 1 to become a secondary oocyte. So out of all the 20 that start as primary, only one is going to continue to be a secondary oocyte. And in the process, we also will release or discard a first polar body. Now, the secondary oocyte arrests in metaphase 2, and it is ovulated in this form. It is not a haploid cell at this point in time. Well, it is haploid, but with double the DNA. So it's not a single set of DNA. It's not ready to combine into a zygote yet. It is going to, if it is fertilized, then it rapidly completes meiosis 2, yielding the ovum, which will join with the sperm DNA to create a zygote. And then the second polar body is with the other half of the genetic material is going to be excrete. This kind of exocytosed, divided out into a second polar body. If not fertilized by a sperm, the oocyte, the secondary oocyte, will deteriorate. So this is a slide. I think it's pretty interesting. It's spermatogenesis versus oogenesis. The total time to produce one gamete, a mature sperm, is about 74 days in males. So remember, there's quite a bit of maturation that needs to occur along the way. But in females, the primary oocyte to become an ovum, it could be a primary oocyte for 13 years. It could be a primary oocyte for 50 years. So the maturation time is much longer. The ability to produce viable gametes for males, it starts in puberty, and the ability continues to pretty old age, like about 70 years old. For females, it begins in fetal life, then it arrests, and it ends in menopause. For males, 4 equal-sized spermatids are produced, which then mature into sperm. For females, 1 ovum containing pretty much all the cytoplasm, all the organelles, all the nutrients and then 2 to 3 small polar bodies. Sometimes that, like I said, that first polar body doesn't continue to divide. And then the number of gametes, so the number of functional gametes that are produced, are about 500 ova for women and over 1 trillion for males, because males produce 90 million sperm per day. This is also interesting. The error rate, the wrong number of chromosomes, is much lower in males. The cystinocytes, they can sense when it's not properly formed, and they phagocytize it. So they tend to not move along into that maturation process. Females have a much higher error rate. These, the majority, if the error is large enough, the pregnancy won't continue. The development of that zygote won't be functional. There are some chromosome abnormalities that will result in a viable fetus, but majority of them will not. For the developing cells, one Sertoli cell or stenocyte sustains many spermatocytes. And then on the reverse, for females, many granulosa cells, because they're going to form all the way around an oocyte, and they'll form one layers, and then they form the corpus luteum. So many granulosa cells sustain one oocyte. And that's mainly because we only have 500 that are, going to develop into ova. All right, so we kind of circle back on both. We try now marry the follicular cycle and what's going on with the oocyte in this diagram. So at birth, we have, well, this doesn't have the oocytes on it. Okay, this just has follicles. So at birth, we have the primordial follicle, which will have a primary oocyte in it. Then during puberty, that if it's stimulated by FSH and LH, the primary follicle becomes, the primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle with one layer of pregranulosa cells. This is going to mature to a secondary follicle with multiple layers of granulosa cells. And then the secondary follicle matures into a Graafian or mature or tertiary follicle, many names. The oocyte is always present in all of the follicular stages. After ovulation occurs, the mature follicle cells form an endocrine structure called the corpus luteum. Okay. So I know you guys are finding this very interesting, but you're also like, that's a lot of information, and what do I kind of need to take home from all of this? So you should be able to separate out these cycles. So if we're talking about an ovarian follicle, to know the sequence. A primordial follicle is what an individual is born with. Then these with hormonal stimulation mature into a primary follicle with one layer of pregranulosa cells. That becomes a secondary follicle with multiple layers of granulosa cells, which becomes a mature antral follicle, which becomes fluid filled and is the follicle type that ruptures during ovulation. During ovulation, this ovum is going to be, or oocyte is going to be released, and then the granulosa cells form the corpus luteum. So I think in general, the follicle phases progress pretty much as you would expect. Primordial to primary to secondary to antral. It has this fluid. to corpus luteum. For the meiotic events, the things to remember are that at birth, we have primary oocytes. That's the cell type at birth. And they are arrested in prophase 1 until puberty. So these have already started meiosis. Then the primary oocyte, if it is selected for development, will continue. If it's the dominant follicle, it continues through meiosis 1 to the secondary oocyte. So this is the dominant follicle only is going to reach secondary oocyte. And then it arrests again in metaphase 2. It does not complete meiosis until it is fertilized. So the sperm fertilizes the secondary oocyte. Meiosis 2 is rapidly completed, forming a second polar body and then an ovum. The ovarian cycle is an average 28-day cycle. It is a series of events associated with maturation of the egg. It also is we're going to marry it up with the uterine cycle. So the ovarian cycle has 2 phases. The first phase is of variable length, okay? It could be 11 days, it could be 14 days, it could be 18 days. The follicular phase is the one that can vary. During the follicular phase, this is where we're recruiting primary follicles, well, primordial into primary follicles. So the follicles are going to be recruited for development, and we'll get a dominant follicle. The oocyte inside the dominant follicle goes from primary to secondary. In between the follicular phase and the luteal phase, this is where ovulation occurs. So follicular phase follicles, so the oocyte plus the granulosa cells are maturing. Then ovulation occurs, and then the second phase, third event, is the luteal phase. The luteal phase is when the corpus luteum is secreting hormones. So 3 events, 2 phases. Follicular phase, follicles need to mature, a dominant follicle emerges. That dominant follicle goes from primary oocyte to secondary oocyte, gets ovulated, and then the luteal phase, the corpus callosum will be producing hormones. Only about 10 to 15% of women have a 28-day cycle. The follicular phase varies, but the luteal phase is always 14 days. Just like when we will get to phases in the uterine cycle, that second 14 days is also is fixed. So they all line up together. During the follicular phase, several follicles become sensitive to FSH and are stimulated to grow. The dominant follicle becomes especially sensitive to FSH. FSH levels start to drop around the middle of the follicular phase. And this is because they're left over from the preceding phase. And the dominant follicle is going to be the only one that is strong enough to survive this dip in FSH. The non-dominant follicles undergo atresia, they self-program death, and the primary oocyte of the dominant follicle completes meiosis 1 to form a secondary oocyte and first polar body. So follicular phase, follicles are recruited, follicles mature, a dominant follicle emerges. That dominant follicle completes meiosis 1 so that the primary oocyte becomes a secondary oocyte, and then a first polar body is given off. Between the follicular phase and the luteal phase, we're going to get ovulation. So we have 11, 14, 18 days of the follicular phase. Then we get an ovulation event. There is a series of reactions that weaken the ovarian wall at that site, and then it ruptures, expelling the secondary oocyte. And then the granulosa cells will become the corpus luteum. In some women, oocytes are released at times unrelated at hormone levels, and depending on the physician you talk to, some will say that this is very common, and some will say it's not common at all. And 1% to 2% of ovulations release more than one secondary oocyte. Sometimes this happens when each ovary has a dominant follicle, and if both are fertilized, that results in fraternal twins. Identical twins result from the fertilization of one oocyte, and then they separate somewhere in the first 7, 10, 14 days of development. Okay, so follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase. After ovulation, the ruptured follicle collapses. The antrum fills with clotted blood, but the remaining granulosa cells and thecal cells form the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum secretes progesterone and some estrogen. The main hormone associated with the corpus luteum is going to be progesterone because it's going to play a role in maintaining the endometrial lining. If no pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum is going to degenerate. Establishing the ovarian cycles. Okay, before puberty, the ovaries secrete small amounts of estrogen inhibiting the hypothalamus. However, as puberty nears, leptin decreases the sensitivity, because it makes the hormones become less estrogen sensitive. And so the estrogen is not adequate enough to suppress the hypothalamus. So gonadotropin releasing hormone is released, stimulating FSH and LH released by the pituitary. So what this slide is saying is that in prepubescent females, that estrogen inhibits the hypothalamus, but leptin, which is produced by adipose tissue, makes the hypothalamus less estrogen sensitive. So even though estrogen is being produced, the hypothalamus isn't sensitive to it, so it will release gonadotropin releasing hormone. So leptin decreases estrogen sensitivity of the hypothalamus. Leptin is produced in direct relationship to the amount of adipose tissue. When a girl hits 100 pounds, she most likely, unless she is an elite gymnast athlete who's just, got tons and tons of muscle. So your average young female, when she reaches 100 pounds, usually has sufficient leptin production to initiate puberty. Okay, so for those of you with little girls, as they start to get, 90 pounds or so, certain talks probably should be occurring. So increase in leptin, hypothalamus becomes less sensitive to estrogen, so it's not being inhibited anymore. And the hypothalamus is going to release gonadotropin releasing hormone, which then stimulates FSH and LH secretion by the anterior pituitary. FSH and LH stimulate follicles to grow, mature, and secrete sex hormones. FSH stimulates granulosa cells to release estrogen. LH prods thecal cells to produce androgens, which are then converted by the granulosa cells to estrogen. So GnRH is released by the hypothalamus. That stimulates the anterior pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And the result of that is an increase in estrogen. This increase in estrogen is going to feed back to the hypothalamus, feed back to the anterior pituitary, and inhibit gonadotropin release, as well as FSH and LH release. There's also a hormone called inhibin that is produced by the granulosa cells that feeds back to the anterior pituitary. This feedback of, so we've had, so starting off with GnRH by the hypothalamus, FSH and LH by the anterior pituitary, now follicles maturing. We've taken that group of 20 and now they're maturing. Those granulosa cells are producing estrogen. Once those 20 are maturing, you don't want to mature all of your eggs. So that higher estrogen, which is still just a middling amount, is going to feed back to the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and stop more follicles from being recruited for development. When that causes a dip in FSH and LH, of those 20, only the dominant follicle will be able to withstand that dip in hormone level, and the rest, the 19, will go into atresia. The dominant follicle is going to continue to mature. So we get more granulosa cells with more estrogen production. The dominant follicle will create a higher estrogen, which then has positive feedback on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, triggering an LH surge. So low levels of estrogen inhibit the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. High levels of estrogen, excuse me, create positive feedback, triggering the LH surge. The LH surge triggers ovulation and formation of the corpus luteum. It also triggers the primary oocyte to become a secondary oocyte that arrests in metaphase 2. After ovulation, the estrogen declines, and this is because those granulosa cells have ruptured, and in that process, they've become damaged. So we have a healthy dominant follicle with lots of granulosa cells producing lots of estrogen. High estrogen then has a positive feedback mechanism to create an LH surge. The LH surge triggers ovulation, but then now that breaks those granulosa cells. They'll reform into the corpus luteum, but while they're doing that, estrogen declines again, and LH transforms the ruptured follicle into the corpus luteum, which is now going to start producing progesterone. Okay. So in the early phases, the hypothalamus is releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone to stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. The follicle stimulating hormone acts on granulosa cells to secrete estrogen, thecal cells to secrete androgens, which are then converted to estrogen. So we get a slightly elevated estrogen from these developing follicles, which then negatively feed back to the hypothalamus. Later in the follicular stage, okay, so now from between here and here, FSH and LH have declined because of this negative feedback. That creates dominant follicle selection. That dominant follicle is going to go from being, the oocyte goes from primary to secondary, but this follicle continues to mature into a mature follicle. So we've got the follicle development versus the oocyte development. As this follicle continues to develop, you can see all of these rows of granulosa cells secrete elevated estrogen. That you can see all these arrows. So very, very high estrogen is going to feed back to the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, positive feedback to create an LH surge. The LH surge triggers ovulation. And this cell is going to now have completed meiosis 1. It's arrested in metaphase of meiosis 2, unless it's fertilized. The rupturing of the follicle damages these granulosa cells. Estrogen levels are going to decline, but the LH then tells the granulosa cells to reform as a corpus luteum. Once the corpus luteum is formed, it's an endocrine structure. It's going to produce high levels of progesterone, as well as start to increase estrogens and something called inhibin, so that we're not maturing more follicles. Negative, so this is just come from here to probably move it up. The negative feedback from the rising plasma progesterone and estrogen levels from the corpus luteum is going to inhibit LH and FSH release, because we're not going to want to mature more follicles until we see whether or not the current secondary oocyte is fertilized. If no fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum degenerates. This causes a sharp decrease in estrogen and progesterone. So we've talked about the ovarian cycle. Now we're going to talk about the uterine cycle. So the uterus, remember, it has 3 layers. See my little chat? Yes. So I'm going to see, so it has the 3 layers, but it's really the 2 layers. You've got the myometrium and then the endometrium. And that endometrium has the stratum basalis and the stratum functionalis. Okay, so that's where we're moving on to now. The uterine cycle is divided into 3 phases. It starts on the first day of menstruation. So that's day 1, and that phase tends to last about 5 days. Then we have the second phase, which is the proliferative phase. It's around 6 to 14 days. But if the follicular phase and the ovary cycle is longer, this proliferative phase is also going to be longer. So those phases are going to be synced up. Then just like we had the luteal phase, we now have the secretory phase, and those end phases are the ones that are always 14 days. So the different cycle lengths are because of the first phase, the follicular phase in the ovary, in the proliferative phase in the uterus. Okay, so 3 phases: menstrual phase, proliferative phase, secretory phase. In the first 5 days of the menstrual cycle, ovarian hormones are at the lowest. So we've got low estrogen and low progesterone. The corpus luteum has degenerated, so progesterone levels are low, and then estrogen levels are low too. Gonadotropin levels are beginning to rise, so FSH, LH. The stratum functionalis is going to detach from the uterine wall. We'll talk about how that happens. But by day 5, the maturing follicles responding to the FSH are going to start increasing estrogen. Rising estrogen levels are going to cause the basalis level to create a new functionalis layer. Estrogen also increases the synthesis of progesterone receptors. Days 1 through 5, menstrual phase, ovarian hormones are low, gonadotropin levels are beginning to rise. The stratum functionalis is going to detach from the uterine wall and shed. And then because the FSH and LH are starting to rise, these ovarian follicles, a group of 20, are starting to mature and release estrogen. Those rising estrogen levels are going to cause the stratum basalis to proliferate and create a stratum functionalis layer. Estrogen also increases the synthesis of progesterone receptors, and this becomes important because the corpus luteum is going to be secreting progesterone. So as long as that corpus luteum is secreting progesterone, the stratum functionalis layer will stay intact. Cervical mucus thins to facilitate sperm passage, and then ovulation occurs around day 14. Days 15 to 18 are considered the secretory phase, and these are going to be characterized by the rising progesterone levels from the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to prompt the functional layer to become what's called a secretory mucosa. Endometrial glands enlarge and start to secrete a whole host of secretions. Cervical mucus plug thickens again to prevent the entry of more sperm pathogens or debris. If fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum degenerates. Progesterone levels fall. When progesterone levels fall, the stratum functionalis is no longer going to be supported. These falling progesterone levels cause the spiral arteries to kink and spasm, and then that cuts off the blood supply to the endometrial cells of that stratum functionalis. So the endometrial cells die. Then the spiral arteries constrict again, which weakens them. Blood rushes in, fragmenting them, and that's what causes the increase of blood flow during menstruation. So the progesterone levels fall, spiral arteries kink, spasm, endometrial cells die. They constrict again, weakening those beds and allowing blood flow to occur. The blood vessels are going to fragment, the functional layer sloughs off, and the cycle begins all over again. This is pretty much the last slide. There are, this one, it just goes over general effects of estrogen, and then there are 2 lengthy tables that are in your book, and I'm not going to go over these. So this is the last slide that we're going to go over. And it's an important slide because it's the correlation of, so here we have the anterior pituitary hormones, we have the ovarian cycle, Then these are the ovarian hormones, and then the uterine cycle. So it puts it all together. Okay, so this is all started off with the hypothalamus is going to, when it has like really low estrogen levels, it will then start this cycle again. So it starts with the hypothalamus really releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone. That then signals the anterior pituitary to start secreting LH and then this little bump of FSH. So we're just here at the very beginning. That small increase in LH and FSH here in this light blue section is going to start the stimulation of maturation in the follicles. As the follicles start to develop, they start to produce estrogen. This phase here of slightly rising estrogen has a negative feedback to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary to decrease follicle stimulating hormone. This decrease in follicle stimulating hormone is going to cause 19 of those maturing follicles to attreat, to not just stop growing. But the dominant follicle is going to continue. That dominant follicle is now going to go from being having a primary oocyte to secondary oocyte and start to develop this antrum of fluid. It has multiple layers of granulosa cells that are doing estrogen, 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 getting to a very high level of estrogen, which then causes positive feedback to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, creating an LH surge. That LH surge triggers ovulation. And then, because these granulosa cells now have been disrupted, estrogen level plummets. However, LH has told the granulosa cells to become a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum will secrete both estrogen and then a lot of progesterone. The progesterone is going to play into the uterine cycle. The stratum functionalis has progesterone receptors. So as long as there is progesterone present, the functional layer will stay intact and start to become secretory. If fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum is going to degrade. That is going to plummet estrogen levels and plummet progesterone levels. This decline in progesterone levels means the stratum functionalis is no longer supported. The spiral arteries kink, cutting off blood supply to these cells. These cells die. They kink again, and they break and fragment due to blood pressure, and that is the blood loss during menses. And then it will just die off, shed off, and we start all over again. The other thing I want to just say is that this small increase in FSH here, this is what stimulates the next set of primordial cells to start developing. Okay, so this graph is a little important in that here the estrogen is getting produced by the maturing follicles, okay? That set of 20 maturing follicles. This estrogen peak is going to be produced by the dominant follicle. And then the estrogen and progesterone here are going to be produced by the corpus luteum. So it is important, or you should know what is causing the estrogen and progesterone levels to be where they are. In this earlier phase, it's the maturing follicles are producing estrogen. Then this low level of estrogen inhibits the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, and it causes this dip in FSH. So most of the maturing follicles attrit. The dominant follicle continues to grow, continues to produce estrogen. That triggers the LH surge and ovulation. The granulosa cells are damaged, so estrogen falls. But in the formation of the corpus luteum will then produce progesterone and estrogen. So there will be a question as to what is the dominant production of hormones on these graphs. This is being supported by progesterone, and that is being produced by the corpus luteum. So this section will take some time. It is section 16, I believe, 2616 in your book. It's about 4 pages long, but it's pretty well written. And I would recommend reading it a few times. Okay, so I think that is it. Except we ran over about 10 minutes, but it's done. That's the end of the reproductive system.